The slap landed flat and loud across the yard, and before the sound had finished bouncing off the wall, Rennick Dupree said the thing that told everyone what it was really about. "We keep this end of the yard a certain way," he said, standing over Ezra Boone with his palms still stinging from the blow. "Your kind crawls in here and thinks the rules bend. They don't." Ezra did not fall. He did not lift his hands. He stood in the gray November light of the exercise yard at Halvern State Correctional, with his cheek already reddening, and he let his arms hang at his sides like 2 lengths of rope. He breathed once. He looked at the man who had hit him, at the wide, soft body, and the homemade ink, and the small, pleased mouth. Then he looked past him at the fence and the flat brown hills beyond it, and he said nothing. 40 men decided in that half-second what kind of man he was. They decided wrong. But you should understand how sure they were, because the whole story turns on how wrong a room of certain men can be, and on the fact that they were wrong about 2 things at once, not one. They were wrong that his silence was fear, and they were wrong that a man who sorts people by their skin can never tell by looking what he is standing in front of. Because Ezra Boone, 3 years earlier, in a hot arena 2 states south, had been the best pair of hands in his weight class in the country. I am not exaggerating for the story. He had a belt. He had a photograph of himself holding it over his head with his mouth open in a shout. And I am going to tell you why a man who could have folded Rennick Dupree in half chose instead to stand there and take a slap and a slur in front of 40 men. But not yet. You have to feel the weight of the silence before you are allowed to know what is under it. For now, know only this. The slap was the first thing. It was not the worst. Ezra had been at Halvern 11 days, and he had come in on a charge that had nothing to do with his hands. A man had died on a wet 2-lane road outside the city, where Ezra trained a car through a stop sign on a black night, and Ezra's truck had been the one it hit. The other driver had been drinking. Every reconstruction said so. But the other driver was white and dead men make clean victims, and Ezra was a large black man with a public face and a lawyer paid by the hour instead of by the case. The prosecutor said vehicular. The jury, 11 of them, nothing like Ezra, said 4 years. He had stopped explaining it to people around the 2nd day because he had learned explaining sounds like begging, and he had promised himself he would not beg in this place. He had made himself other promises too. The largest one he kept folded so tight that even he did not look at it straight. It had to do with his hands, and what they had done once, long before the road, in a ring with a referee and 10,000 people, and a young fighter named Terrence Van on the canvas, who did not get up. But I am ahead of myself. Watch how hard it is to keep that promise buried. The difficulty is the story. His cell was on the 2nd tier, a 2-man box he shared with an older man named Odell Farr, who had been inside 19 years and had the calm of a man who has stopped counting. Farr made coffee out of a packet and hot tap water and drank it slow. He watched Ezra come in on the 11th night with the mark still ghosting on his cheek, and he did not ask about it right off. "You gotta look," Farr said, instead, folding a state towel into a perfect square, corner to corner, the way he did everything small and exact. "The look of a man deciding something." "Decided it already," Ezra said. "What'd you decide?" "To be nobody in here. Do my 4, walk out the same shape I came in." Farr set the towel down. Boots went by on the tier unhurried. "Fine plan," he said. "I had that plan once. Man slapped you in the yard today. Whole block heard before dinner. Heard what he said, too." Ezra sat on the bottom bunk, elbows on his knees, and looked at his own hands hanging between them. If you had been in that cell, you would have seen him do a strange, small thing. He turned his right hand palm up and studied it, then closed it very slowly into a fist, then, very deliberately, opened it and laid it flat on his knee, like a man putting a dog back in its kennel. He did it without seeming to know he did it. "I'm not going to be a problem," Ezra said. "Not for him. Not for anybody." Farr watched the hand go flat. He had seen a great many men in 19 years, and he knew the difference between a man who cannot fight and a man who has decided not to. He filed away what he saw and said only, "Out there they sort us at a glance, and we can't do a thing about it. In here it's the same, except in here there's nowhere to walk to after. Being nobody is the loudest thing you can be. Nobody is who they practice on." He was right. But Ezra had already chosen, and the choosing was the whole of it, and he lay back and stared at the springs of the empty top bunk and kept his hands open at his sides, on purpose, all night, like a man holding a door shut with his body. The next morning, the door came open anyway. It happened in the chow hall, which is where most things at Halvern happened, because it was the one place 300 men stood close with trays in their hands and old grievances in their chests. Ezra had learned to take the end seat near the wall, back to the block, eyes down. Powdered eggs, 2 slices of bread, a carton of milk. He ate the way you eat when you are trying to disappear. Dupree came down the aisle with 2 men behind him. He did not sit. He looked at the eggs and the milk and said, "You didn't nod at me this morning." Ezra kept eating. "When I walk past," Dupree said, "you nod. That's how we know you know your place." He reached down with one thick finger and tipped the milk carton so it glugged out white across the tray and into Ezra's lap, cold soaking through the state khakis to the skin. "Now you look about right. Wet and quiet." The near tables went still. Not the whole room. Most of the room kept eating because most of the room had learned that watching gets you noticed. But the 3 closest tables went still to see what the big new fish would do, with cold milk running off his thighs onto the floor. Ezra set his fork down. He looked at the mess. And here is what he did, and hold on to it, because a room decided one thing, and the truth was another. He picked up the 2 slices of bread before they could get wet, moved them to the dry corner of the tray, and went on eating those slowly. Eyes forward, milk dripping off him onto the concrete with a small, steady tap. Dupree laughed, delighted. "House broke," he announced to the room. "See that? They can learn." He clapped a man on the shoulder and moved off, and the near tables exhaled, and the story of Ezra Boone the coward was now a thing 300 men would carry to their cells. An old man, 2 seats down, thin, white-haired, with a tremor in his left hand that never stopped, leaned over. His name was Silas Kemp, and he had been at Halvern longer than some of the guards had been alive. He was a black man who had watched a great many young ones come through, and he spoke low under the noise. "Son, I've watched men do what you're doing. Swallow it, and think swallowing keeps you safe." His tremoring hand found Ezra's forearm and rested there, light as a bird. It doesn't. A man like Dupree, silence isn't peace to him. It's permission. You keep sitting still, you're just telling him what he can order next, and the price goes up every time. You hear me? With him, the price always goes up. Something moved behind Ezra's face. Something that wanted to say, "I know exactly what these hands can do, and that is precisely why I keep them shut." But he only said, "Thank you for the bread," and he wiped his fork on the dry corner and kept eating. Silas took his hand back and shook his head, mostly to himself. "That's not a scared man. I know scared. That's a man scared of himself." He was closer to the truth than anyone at Halvern would get for a long time. There was a camera in the corner of the chow hall, and the man whose job it was to watch us. His name was Officer Brant Naylor. He sat in a booth with 6 screens and a cold cup of the coffee Farr made better in his cell, and he had watched Dupree tip the carton, and he had watched the old man's hand tremble on the new inmate's arm, and in his log, in his small, tight hand, he wrote 2 words. No incident. I am telling you about Naylor now because he matters later, and because it would be too easy to make this only about one man in a yard. Dupree was one man. The camera and the cold coffee and the 2 words, "no incident," were the system. And the system had learned to look at a black man wearing his breakfast and see nothing worth writing down. Naylor was not the kind of man who used the words Dupree used. He would have told you sincerely that he did not have a prejudiced bone in him, but he had a daughter in her 2nd year at a state college and a mortgage 40 minutes from the prison and 11 years toward a pension he could not afford to lose. And Dupree kept the north yard quiet, and quiet was easier to supervise. So, every time he wrote "no incident" over something done to a man like Ezra, and not to a man like Dupree, he told himself it was about order, and not about who. That is how the quiet kind of it works. It never has to say a word. Ezra did not know Naylor's name yet, but he understood exactly what those 2 words meant. He had asked a floor officer that first week whether there was somewhere a man could report a problem, and the officer had looked at him with something between pity and boredom and said, "Sure, fill out a request. Goes in the box." And Ezra had understood from the way he said "box" that the box was where things went to stop existing, and he had a good idea which men's requests went into it, and which men's did not. So the system would not help him, and his own hands he had locked away. That left him nothing, which was, in a way, the exact arithmetic he had walked in with. Be nobody. Take what comes. Do the 4. Walk out the same shape. He told himself he could hold that line. Dupree spent the next week proving he could not. It went in stages the way these things go, each worse than the last, each one testing whether the price could climb again the way old Silas had promised. First, the phone. 4 phones on the north tier, 15 minutes if the line allowed, and Ezra stood in that line on a Sunday to call the only number he called, his younger sister Marlene Boone, who was raising the question of the appeal and the money for it in a small apartment 2 states away, and needed his voice more than he needed to make the call. When Ezra reached the front, Dupree's man, a lean, nervous one they called Rook, stepped in front of him and picked up the receiver. "Lines for us first," Rook said, not dialing, just holding the phone to his ear, listening to a dial tone, watching Ezra see what he'd do. "You wait till we're done. All of you. Wait." Ezra stepped out of line. He went back to his cell without his call. And on the bottom bunk he did the thing with his hand again, the fist and the slow release. The dog put back in its kennel. And Farr watched from across the cell and said nothing, but saw everything. That was Sunday. On Tuesday, it was the yard, and this time Dupree did not slap him, because the slap had gotten nothing. Instead, Dupree waited until Ezra was doing push-ups against the cold ground, the one thing Ezra let himself do, the one place his body was allowed to be a body. And Dupree walked over and set one boot flat between Ezra's shoulder blades at the top of a push-up and pressed him down, slow, using his weight, so Ezra's chest and face went into the frozen dirt and his arms shook, holding the 2 of them up. "This is a good look on you," Dupree said, pleasant to the back of Ezra's head, loud enough for the yard. "Down there in the dirt? That's the natural order right there. Everybody can see it." He leaned harder. "Stay down. That's your level." And Ezra stayed down. He held the weight of a grown man on his back with arms that had once put a national contender on the canvas, and he let his face go into the dirt, and he did not throw the man off, though throwing him off would have been the easiest thing his body had ever done. The yard watched. Silas Kemp watched from the wall with his shaking hand pressed to his own mouth. And when Dupree finally stepped off, laughing, Ezra pushed himself up, spat dirt, and finished his set. 10 more slow, exact counting under his breath, because the counting was the only thing keeping the door shut. That night, Silas found him at the edge of the day room. "You could have put him in the infirmary," Silas said. Not a question. The old man had watched a lot of push-ups in his years and had seen how Ezra's arms hadn't truly strained under the boot.
I saw it. You weren't struggling. You were allowing it. Why? In God's name, son, why let a man like that make you the picture he wants?
And for the first time, Ezra said a piece of it aloud. The only piece he could stand. Because I know what happens when I don't let him. I've seen it. And I would rather be what he thinks I am for 4 years than be what I really am for 1 second. He looked at the old man. He wants me to be less than a man. I know how to be more than one. And that scares me worse than he does. Silas did not understand it, but he heard under the words that they were true, and he stopped asking why for a while. The thing about a secret in a prison is that it does not stay buried, because a prison is 300 men with nothing to do but notice each other. It came apart on a Thursday in the law library, 2 shelves of outdated books and 4 plastic chairs and a sign-up sheet where Ezra had gone to sit with the paperwork of his appeal because sitting with it made him feel like he was doing something for Marlene. A younger man named Coy Whitlock was in there, restless in for something to do with cars, and Coy kept looking at Ezra sideways and finally said, "Man, I know you. I've been trying to place you 2 weeks. You're Boone. Ezra Boone." Coy sat forward, suddenly awake. "You had the belt. I watched you fight. I watched you fight Terrence Van. My uncle took me. I was there. You're the—" "Undoing 4 years for a car wreck," Ezra said, low and fast, cutting it off. "That's who I am in here. That's the only man I am in here." Too late, and both knew it, because Coy Whitlock was not cruel, but he was young, and he had just learned that the coward the whole block laughed at was a national champion. And a thing like that does not stay in one mouth. By dinner, it had legs. By lockdown, it ran the length of the tier. The new fish, the one who ate cold milk off his own bread, who let Dupree stand on his back. That man had a belt in a box somewhere, and hands that had ended careers. And the story did not make the men respect Ezra. Watch this, because it is the cruel machinery of the place. It made them uneasy, and it made Dupree furious. Because if the man could fight, and did not, then every man who had touched his shoulder in the aisle, every man who had laughed at the milk, had been slapping a sleeping bear and calling himself brave. And there is nothing a small man hates like being shown he was safe only because a bigger man allowed it. It reached Dupree last, the way these things do, and it reached him wrong. Rook told him in the cell that night. Dupree did not believe it, then believed it, and belief made him something worse than a bully. It made him a man who had been laughed at behind his own back. He had stood on a champion's spine and called it the natural order. And now 40 men knew the champion had simply let him. In Dupree's arithmetic, that was not mercy. That was a black man making a fool of him on purpose in front of his own yard, which, to a man built the way Dupree was built, was the one unforgivable thing. "He's been playing me the whole time," Dupree said in the dark of his cell, and the mean thing that lived in his chest went cold and specific. "Thinks he's better than me. Thinks he can stand there and let me, and have everybody watching think he's the bigger man." He lay awake the way Ezra lay awake, both of them holding something with their whole bodies, one a door and one a grudge. "We'll see who's the bigger man. We'll see." The price old Silas had said. It always goes up. It was about to go all the way up. The last quarter of a story like this is where the man is supposed to find his path. Watch instead where he loses it entirely. Dupree did not come at Ezra in the open because the open had gotten him only laughter. He came at him in the blind spot, and he brought help. And he chose the one place in Halvern the camera could not see. There was a corridor between the laundry and the industry shop where the men filed through to work, and a stretch of it, maybe 15 feet long, where the wall jutted and the ceiling camera caught the mouth and the far end, but not the middle. Every man on the tier knew about those 15 feet. It was where debts got collected. Naylor in his booth knew about it too, and had written more than one no incident about men who walked in whole and came out limping because the camera saw them enter fine and leave more or less fine, and the middle was a place the log did not go. They caught Ezra there on a Friday on the way to the shop. Rook and another man came from behind and pinned him into the jut of the wall, and Dupree came from the front, and in the blind 15 feet, Dupree did what he had been building toward for 2 weeks. He hit Ezra Boone. Not a slap. A closed fist, into the body, into the ribs. The kind of shot Dupree had thrown 100 times at men who could not throw it back. And Ezra did not throw it back. Understand what that cost. In the space of one breath, Ezra Boone could have taken all 3 of them apart, and every instinct trained into his bones over 20 years stood up and demanded to be let out. And Ezra held the door. He put his back to the wall and covered his head and his ribs with his arms, the way you cover up in a corner. And he took it, because the alternative was to open his hands, and he had seen what his open hands could do. He had seen Terrence Van not get up. He had promised over that stretcher that he would never again be the reason a man did not get up, not for pride, not for pain, not even for this. So he covered up and took a beating in 15 feet of concrete, and did not throw one punch. While Dupree, breathing hard, told him between shots exactly what he thought a man like Ezra was. The whole, ugly, small sermon of it. The words a narrator will not repeat, because the narrator does not carry them. Only the consequence. They left him on the floor. He got himself up, because staying down would bring a guard, and a guard meant questions, and questions were the same as begging. He walked into the shop and worked his shift bent around his cracked ribs, gray in the face, and at the end of it collapsed at his station, and that finally brought the guards, and that finally brought the infirmary. The prison doctor counted 2 cracked ribs and a fracture in his left hand where he had shielded his skull, and asked how it happened. And Ezra said he fell on the stairs, because that was the only answer that let him keep breathing in that place. And Naylor in his booth watched the footage of Ezra walking into the corridor upright and being helped out of it, bent, saw the 15 blind feet between, and wrote in his small, tight hand the 2 words, "No incident." That is the failure. The real one. The total one. Not almost. Ezra Boone lay in the infirmary with his hand splinted and his ribs taped and his whole plan in ruins, because the plan had been to be nobody and take what came and walk out the same shape. And now the whole block knew he was a champion who would not fight. And that knowledge had not saved him. It had doubled the beatings, and the system meant to catch it had looked straight at it and written that nothing had occurred. He had done everything he swore he would do. He had kept the door shut. He had not become the man who ends men. And it had bought him a broken hand and a bed in the infirmary, and a sister on the phone crying about an appeal he could no longer see the far side of. He lay in the dark and thought for the first time since Terrence Van that keeping the door shut might not be strength at all. It might just be a slower way of being destroyed. He was wrong about that too. But he could not know yet what was coming, because it did not come from him. It came from the one place he had stopped expecting anything, and it came for the man who had broken his ribs. 3 days later, the boiler in the industry shop failed. Halvern's shop ran an old, high-pressure steam boiler that heated the laundry and the metal shop, both the kind of aging iron the state kept promising to replace in a budget that never arrived. On the morning it failed, 22 inmates were at their stations, and 2 officers were on the floor, and among the 22 on cleanup detail, because he had lost his phone privileges and needed the good time credit, was Rennick Dupree. Ezra was there too, cleared for light duty. Left hand still splinted, ribs still taped. Sweeping the far end of the shop, slowly, one-handed. The failure was not an explosion. I am not going to give you an explosion, because that is not what happened, and because the truth is worse and quieter. A weld on the main steam line let go, and the line whipped, and a valve wheel sheared, and a jet of live steam under high pressure came screaming out sideways across the shop at the exact height of a working man's chest. Steam like that does not look like much. That is the horror of it. It is nearly invisible, and hot enough to strip a man to the bone in seconds, and it filled the near end of the shop in a white roar, and men ran. And in the running, Rennick Dupree went down. He went down because a rolling supply cart shoved by a fleeing man clipped his bad knee, and he fell the wrong way, toward the boiler, into the edge of the expanding cloud, and the scald caught his legs and one side, and he screamed and could not get up, and the steam was spreading toward him, and every man in that shop was running the other way, toward the door, toward the far wall, away. Every man but one. Ezra Boone dropped the broom. Here is the moment. The whole story folded into 2 seconds. Because, for the length of one breath, Ezra stood at the far end and looked through the white roar at Rennick Dupree on the floor. The man who had slapped him for fun and called it the natural order, tipped milk in his lap, stood on his spine, cracked his ribs in a blind corridor, and preached at him while he did it. And Ezra understood with perfect clarity that he could simply not go, that no one would ever blame him, that the camera and the log and the whole indifferent machine of Halvern would write it down as an accident, and the man who had made his days a torment would be gone, and Ezra would have done nothing, kept his hands clean and his door shut, and his promise whole by doing nothing at all. He could let a man who thought Ezra was less than human prove himself wrong in the most final way. And no one would ever know Ezra had chosen it. And Ezra Boone ran into the steam. He did not run in like a hero out of a film. He ran in low, the way he had been taught to move under pressure, one arm across his own face, the splinted hand tucked, and he got to Dupree through heat that took the skin off his forearm, in a stripe he would carry the rest of his life. And he got his good hand into the collar of Dupree's shirt, and he dragged. A grown man, dead weight, screaming across a concrete floor with one working hand and 2 cracked ribs, out of the spreading cloud and into the clear, and on toward the door, where other men, shamed suddenly out of their running by the sight of the man they'd called a coward, carrying the man they'd called a king, finally turned back to help. They got Dupree out. They got them both out. And Ezra Boone stood in the cold yard air with his forearms scalded raw, and Dupree's blood and his own mixing on his shirt, and he looked at his hands, the good one and the splinted one, and for the first time in 3 years, he was not afraid of them. Because they had just done the opposite of what they did to Terrence Van. They had kept a man in the world instead of putting him out of it. And the door he had been holding shut with his whole body for 3 years came open, and what came out was not the thing he feared. It was just Ezra. You need to hear him say it, because it is the thing that turns everything. It happened in the infirmary that night, the 2 of them in beds across a narrow aisle. Dupree wrapped and sedated, and Ezra with fresh dressing on his arm. The whole prison already knew, because 20 men had seen it, and this time there was no blind. 15 feet this time, the story ran true. The man they called a coward had run into live steam for the man who broke his ribs. Nobody knew what to do with it. It did not fit any shape the block understood, least of all the shape Dupree had spent 2 weeks insisting on. Dupree surfaced from the sedation past midnight and turned his head and saw who was in the bed across from him, and his face did a thing it had never done in front of anyone at Halvern. It came apart. Why? he said, cracked and small.
After everything after what I called you, why would you?
Ezra lay looking at the ceiling, and he told it. Not to the block, not to a camera, not to a hearing. To one man in the dark who had earned no piece of it and was getting it anyway, which is the only kind of grace that counts. 3 years ago, I fought a man named Terrence Van for the belt. He was better than they said. In the 10th round, I put him down, and he didn't get up, and he didn't get up. And they carried him out on a board, and he spent 9 days on a machine before his mother let them turn it off. His voice was even worn smooth, a thing he had said to himself 10,000 times and never once out loud. I killed a man with these hands, doing the thing I was best at in the world. And I swore over him to his mother that I would never let these hands do that again. Not for pride, not to defend myself, not for anything. He turned his head. You stood on my back and told the yard that was the natural order, and I let you. Not because I believed you, because the second I open these hands to hurt a man, I don't know how to stop them. I've never known how to stop them. That's not weakness, you saw. That was the most scared I've ever been. I was scared of me, not you. You were never big enough to scare me. The infirmary was very still. Down the block, a metal door rolled shut on its track. And today, Ezra said, in that shop I finally got to find out what these hands do when I let them go, and it isn't to hurt somebody. Turns out they pull a man out of the fire, even a man like you. He looked back at the ceiling. You spent 2 weeks telling everybody what I was. Now they know. And so do you. Rennick Dupree, who had run the North Yard through fear, and worse than fear, for 6 years, put his wrapped arm over his face in the dark and did not answer, because there was no answer, and the not answering was the truest thing he had ever offered another man. It did not fix everything. Stories that tell you it fixed everything are lying, and I promised at the start I would not. But it opened a crack, and the crack ran in a direction no one expected. And it started with Officer Brant Naylor. Naylor had watched the shop footage. There was no blind spot in the shop. He had watched on his 6 screens with his cold coffee the man he had written no incident about run into live steam for the man he had protected with those same 2 words. And something in Naylor that had been asleep for 11 years toward a pension woke all the way up and would not go back down. He sat in his booth a long time. He thought about his daughter at the state college and his mortgage and the 11 years. He thought about the corridor with the 15 blind feet, the milk carton, the boot on the spine, the words Dupree used in the open that Naylor had heard through the yard mic and logged as nothing. He had told himself for years that his no incident was about order, not about who. Now he made himself look at the whole ledger of it, every incident he had waved past, and he saw the pattern in his own handwriting. The men he protected all looked one way. The men he wrote off all looked another. It had never once been about order. He did not go to the box. He knew what the box was, and he knew whose requests it swallowed. Instead, he requested through the one channel he had that could not be quietly folded away, a formal review of every incident report he had personally filed on the North Tier for the past 90 days, and he attached his own written statement in his small, tight hand, correcting the record. Where he had written no incident, he wrote what had occurred. The milk, the corridor, the blind 15 feet he had known about and logged around. The words Dupree used and Naylor filed as heir. He named Dupree. He named Rook. And he named himself first at the top as the officer who watched and wrote that nothing happened, and who now understood that the deciding of whose pain counted had been happening in his own hand the whole time. It would cost him. He knew it would. A man who confesses to falsifying 90 days of logs does not keep his booth, or maybe his pension. He filed it anyway because he had watched a man run into fire for an enemy, and after you watch that, you cannot go back to writing that fire is nothing. That review could not be pocketed because Naylor sent it to the State Corrections Oversight Office outside Halvern's walls, where a warden could not make it vanish. It was not a cavalry riding in from the sky. It was one guilty man inside the system, deciding to write the truth down where the men above him could not erase it. That is smaller than a rescue, and it is bigger because it was chosen, and it was paid for. Silas Kemp, who had spent decades watching that place practice on the men it decided did not count, was called to give a statement, and the old man with the shaking hand told all of it. The milk, and the yard, and the push-up, and the words into a recorder held by a woman from the oversight office. And his voice did not shake, though his hand never stopped. Here is how it came apart, and it was not tidy, because the machine at Halvern was old and stubborn and did not fall in one clean stroke. Dupree was moved off the North Tier, his good time credit pulled, and a charge filed for the corridor assault, and he did not fight it, which was its own kind of turn, a man declining for the first time to lie his way clear. Rook was transferred to a different facility. The blind corridor got a camera bolted into the jut of the wall within a month, one small, permanent change in the concrete that would outlast every man in this story. Naylor was placed on leave pending the review, and the review was long, and in the end, he was not fired, but he was not returned to the booth either. They moved him to intake, where he processed new men coming through the gate, and where it turned out an officer who had learned the hard way what a lie in a log costs a human being was exactly the right man to be the first face a frightened new inmate saw. His daughter stayed in her second year. His mortgage got paid. It was not extravagant. It was a man keeping most of his life by finally telling the truth with the part of it he was willing to risk. The warden's office issued no grand statement because institutions do not confess, they adjust. But the North Tier was different after. Not saved. Different. The men who had touched Ezra's shoulder in the aisle did not apologize, because men in that place do not. But they stopped. And the stopping was the apology. And Ezra Boone, national champion coward man who ran into steam-healed slow. The ribs knit. The hand came out of the splint stiff and never quite worked the way it had, which he did not mind, because he had no more use for the thing it had been built to do. The scald on his forearm went to a smooth, pale stripe he could run his thumb over, and did when he was thinking, the way he used to close and open his fist. The new gesture replaced the old one. He did not put the dog back in the kennel anymore. He touched the scar that proved his hands could pull instead of break. Marlene Boone got the appeal money together with help from people who had watched her brother fight years before and had read now in a small item that ran in one paper about a boxing champion who took a beating in prison rather than raise his hands, and who ran into a boiler failure for the man who broke his ribs. The item did not use his old title in the headline. It used a new word. It called him, in the last line, a man who found out who he was. The appeal did not free him. Stories that free the man are lying too. But it took a year off the 4 on the drunk driver, and the reconstruction, and the stop sign, and the defense that finally got heard, and a year off 4 is not nothing to a man counting. Silas Kemp did not live to see Ezra walk out. He went in his sleep 2 winters later, the tremoring hand finally still, and Ezra sat with the old man's few things afterward, the folded towels, the coffee packets, and kept one of the towels folded corner to corner, the exact way Farr folded his, and carried it out with him when his day came. Rennick Dupree finished his sentence at a different facility and got out 8 months after Ezra. What became of him is mostly silence, which is what becomes of most men. But there is one thing. A letter came to Ezra's sister's address, no return, 3 lines in a heavy, uneven hand. It said only that the man who wrote it had a job on a loading dock, that he had not raised his hand or his voice against anyone in a year, and that he thought about the shop every day. It was not forgiveness asked for or given. It was a man reporting that he was so far being a person the way Ezra had told him to. Ezra read it once, did not answer it, and did not throw it away. Odell Farr made coffee for a new man on the bunk after Ezra and told him on his first hard night about a champion who was scared of his own hands and learned what they were for. Coy Whitlock got outworked in a garage and told the fight to anyone who would listen, and told it right, the running in part, not the getting hit part. And Brant Naylor stood at intake on a cold morning and processed a young black man through the gate who came in with his shoulders up around his ears, terrified, silent, deciding to be nobody. Naylor slid him his papers and looked at him a second longer than the job required and said, low, not in the log, "Being nobody in here is the loudest thing you can be. Say something the first time. Don't wait. And if a man in here writes down that nothing happened to you, you find me." The young man did not understand it yet. He would. Ezra Boone walked out of Halvern State Correctional on a bright, cold morning with a folded towel in his bag and a pale stripe on his forearm. He did not go back to fighting. He took work at a gym in the city where his sister lived, not training fighters to hurt each other, but teaching the footwork and the discipline and the breathing, the parts of the thing that had nothing to do with the last punch. He was good at it. Patient in a way that surprised people who had only heard about the belt. His sister asked him once, watching him wrap a stranger's hands with the stiff fingers of his own bad hand, whether he ever missed it, the ring, the belt, the roar. Ezra Boone ran his thumb along the smooth stripe on his forearm and thought about it. "No, that," he said. "These hands do a better thing now." He turned back to the work. Ezra Boone had the power to destroy the man who hated him for his skin, and the hardest thing he ever did was refuse to use it. Have you ever held a strength inside you that frightened you more than any enemy? Could a thing you kept locked away because you did not trust yourself to control it? And here is the harder question. When the person who degraded you was suddenly the one in danger, what would your hands have done, honestly, before your better self could stop them? Tell me in the comments about a time you chose mercy when no one alive would have blamed you for choosing otherwise. If this story reached something in you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that restraint can be the loudest kind of strength there is.